The first time I noticed her, it wasn't because she stood out. It was because everything else seemed to fade. The noise of the room softened, conversations blurred into background hum, and for a brief moment, time felt strangely suspended. She was simply there, calm, unhurried, existing in a way that felt grounded and real. I didn't know her name, her story, or the reasons that had shaped her, yet something about her presence unsettled me in the most unexpected way. I told myself it was nothing, a passing impression, a coincidence of mood and timing. But as the days passed, the thought of her returned without warning. Not vividly, not obsessively, just enough to linger. I began to notice how my attention shifted, how I listened differently, how I questioned feelings I had long assumed were settled. It was unsettling to realize that someone I barely knew had already begun to influence the quiet spaces of my mind. What frightened me most was not the attraction itself, but the sense of possibility it carried. Possibility meant change, and change meant risk. I had grown comfortable with emotional distance, with predictability, with keeping my heart guarded. Yet something about her made that distance feel unnecessary, even fragile. Without effort, without intention, she had reopened a door I believed had closed long ago, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to step through it or pretend it had never opened at all. In the days that followed, I became aware of how easily she had entered my thoughts. Not as a distraction, but as a quiet presence that appeared during ordinary moments. While walking familiar streets or sitting alone with my coffee, I caught myself wondering what she might be doing. What kind of memories shaped the calm expression she carried so naturally? These thoughts felt intrusive at first, as if they didn't belong to me. I tried to analyze the feeling, to categorize it as curiosity or coincidence, but the truth was less convenient. Something about her had disrupted the balance I relied on. I had spent years convincing myself that independence was strength, that emotional restraint was wisdom. Yet now, those beliefs felt thin, like carefully arranged structures that could collapse under the weight of a single honest emotion. What unsettled me most was the realization that I wanted to know her, not to possess, not to impress, but to understand. I wanted to hear her thoughts, to see how she reacted to silence, to learn the things she cared about when no one was watching. That desire felt dangerous, because it required openness, and openness meant surrendering control. Still, despite my hesitation, I sensed that resisting this pull would cost me more than following it ever could. As time passed, the sense of distance I had carefully maintained began to feel artificial. I noticed how my attention sharpened whenever she entered a room, how even the smallest change in her expression drew my focus without effort. It wasn't obsession, nor was it fantasy. It felt quieter than that, more deliberate, as if my mind was slowly making space for something it had long avoided. I became aware of my own hesitation, the internal negotiations I conducted in silence. Part of me urged restraint, reminding me of how easily expectations could lead to disappointment. Another part, quieter but persistent, suggested that avoiding risk was no longer protecting me, it was limiting me. I had confused safety with stagnation, and the realization left me unsettled. What struck me most was how natural the shift felt. There was no dramatic turning point, no moment of certainty. Instead, it was a gradual alignment, a subtle movement toward openness. I began to understand that connection did not demand immediate answers or promises. It asked only for presence and honesty. And in that understanding, I sensed that something meaningful was unfolding, whether I was ready to name it or not. The more I allowed myself to remain present, the more I noticed how deeply her presence affected my inner world. Simple moments began to feel layered with meaning, shared silences, passing glances, the calm assurance in her movements. I realized that connection didn't always announce itself with intensity. Sometimes it arrived gently, asking only to be acknowledged rather than questioned. I started paying closer attention to myself, to the emotions I usually dismissed or postponed. Being near her made those feelings surface without resistance. I no longer felt the need to analyze every reaction or protect myself from what might follow. Instead, I found a quiet strength in acceptance, in letting moments exist without trying to control their outcome. What surprised me most was how peaceful this shift felt. There was no urgency, no pressure to define what we were becoming. It was enough to recognize the change taking place within me. I understood that love, at its core, was not about certainty or guarantees. It was about allowing yourself to be seen, even when the future remained undefined. And for the first time, that uncertainty felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. As the days blended together, I noticed how my sense of time subtly shifted. Moments no longer rushed past me, they unfolded with intention. I became more attentive to pauses, to the space between actions, to the quiet after words faded. Her presence had slowed my inner rhythm, encouraging me to observe rather than anticipate, to feel rather than calculate. I began to understand how deeply I had relied on emotional distance as a form of certainty. Keeping people at arm's length had once felt like clarity, a way to avoid confusion and disappointment. Now, that same distance felt hollow. Being near her revealed how much meaning existed in closeness, not the kind that overwhelms, but the kind that steadies and grounds. It wasn't about dependence, it was about shared awareness. What lingered most was a growing sense of authenticity. I felt less inclined to present a version of myself shaped by caution. Instead, I allowed honesty to surface naturally, without performance or expectation. It became clear that connection didn't require perfection, only sincerity. And within that sincerity, something enduring began to form, quiet, resilient, and patiently unfolding, without needing to be named to feel real. With time, I noticed how deeply she influenced the way I experienced the world around me. Familiar places seemed altered, not because they had changed, but because my perception had. Streets felt warmer, conversations felt more intentional, and even silence carried a sense of meaning. It was as if her presence had tuned me into a different frequency, one that made everything feel slightly more alive. I reflected on the distance I once believed was necessary for balance. I had mistaken emotional detachment for self-control, assuming that caring less meant hurting less. Yet now, I understood that detachment had only numbed me. Being open to her presence brought vulnerability, yes, but it also brought clarity. I was learning that feeling deeply was not a weakness, it was a form of awareness I had long denied myself. What surprised me most was how effortless this transformation felt. There was no struggle to become someone else, no pressure to change. I was simply allowing myself to respond honestly to what was already there. And in that honesty, I sensed the beginning of something lasting, not defined by labels or expectations, but by a shared understanding that connection, when nurtured patiently, could reshape even the most guarded heart. As our connection continued to unfold, I became increasingly aware of how much trust it required, trust not only in her, but in myself. I had spent years relying on predictability, shaping my life around routines that demanded little emotional risk. Now those routines felt incomplete. Being near her invited spontaneity, reflection, and a willingness to accept moments as they came, without rehearsing every possible outcome. I noticed how easily conversations drifted into silence, and how comfortable that silence felt. It was not empty or awkward, it was full, layered with unspoken understanding. In those moments, I realized that true closeness did not require constant affirmation. It thrived in shared presence, in the ability to exist together without explanation or defense. What stayed with me most was the sense that something essential had shifted inside. I was no longer observing my emotions from a distance. I was living within them, allowing them to guide rather than restrain me. And though uncertainty remained, it no longer felt paralyzing. Instead, it felt honest, a reminder that meaningful connections are not built on certainty, but on the courage to remain open when answers are still forming. Gradually, I began to notice how my priorities were changing. Things that once demanded my full attention now felt secondary, while moments spent in her presence carried an unexpected weight. It wasn't that my world had narrowed. It had become more focused. I found myself valuing depth over distraction, choosing meaning instead of noise. This shift felt natural, as if I were finally aligning with a rhythm that had always existed beneath the surface. I reflected on how rarely I had allowed myself to be fully present with another person. Distractions had often served as shields, keeping emotions manageable and distant. With her, those shields felt unnecessary. I listened more carefully, observed more closely, and responded more honestly. It was in this attentiveness that I discovered a new kind of intimacy, one built not on intensity, but on consistency and mutual awareness. What lingered most was the sense of quiet commitment forming within me. Not a promise spoken aloud, but an internal resolve to remain open, to engage fully rather than retreat. I understood that love did not require certainty to exist. It required intention. And in choosing to stay present, even when the future remained undefined, I realized I was already stepping into something deeper than I had ever planned to allow. The days blurred, but each encounter left its mark. I noticed how even brief moments, our eyes meeting across a crowded room, her laughter carried by the wind, the subtle warmth when our hands brushed, resonated far longer than expected. These small fragments of time began to feel like a thread weaving through my life, connecting ordinary moments with something quietly profound. I reflected on how unusual this was for me. I had long avoided intimacy, equating it with vulnerability and risk. Yet now, the desire to understand her, to be near her, had grown stronger than the instinct to withdraw. I realized that avoidance had protected me from nothing but the depth of connection, and that by remaining closed, I had missed subtle joys I hadn't even noticed before. What stayed with me most was the way her presence made the world feel alive. Streets, cafes, and quiet corners seemed charged with significance. Love wasn't arriving as a dramatic force or sudden revelation. It was creeping into everyday life, patient and persistent, reshaping my perspective with gentle insistence. And in that quiet, I understood that some bonds are not announced. They are felt gradually in the spaces between ordinary moments. Weeks passed, and the rhythm between us settled into something steady yet fragile, like the delicate balance of a melody that refuses to be rushed. I found myself noticing patterns I had never considered: how she tilted her head when thinking, the quiet way she lingered at doorways, the subtle intonation in her voice when a topic mattered. Each observation was a small revelation, a layer that drew me closer without fanfare or urgency. I also began to confront the fears I had carried for years. The thought of vulnerability, of letting someone in, had always felt risky. Yet with her, it felt like a necessity. I realized that my old defenses had not shielded me, they had isolated me. Being present with her required courage, not perfection, honesty rather than performance. And as I allowed myself to exist fully in those moments, I felt the first true sense of emotional freedom in a long time. What struck me most was how unremarkable it all seemed, yet how monumental it truly was. There was no dramatic turning point, no declaration of intent. Just awareness, attention, and the willingness to show up. I understood then that love often doesn't arrive in fireworks. It arrives quietly, consistently, and patiently, demanding nothing but presence, yet shaping everything in its path. One evening, as twilight painted the city in muted gold and purple, I felt the full weight of what had been unfolding between us. The streets seemed quieter, the air heavier with expectation that wasn't spoken aloud. In that calm, I realized how much I had come to rely on her, not out of necessity, but because her presence had become an anchor, a steadying force in a life I had long kept compartmentalized. I noticed how instinctively I sought her in the small moments. A glance in a cafe, a shadow across the park, the sound of her laughter echoing faintly in my memory. Each trace left a mark, shaping my thoughts and actions without command. It was subtle, invisible to others, yet undeniable to me. And in that realization, I understood the depth of what had begun. Love that did not roar but lingered, persistent and insistent. What unsettled me most was the awareness that this connection required openness, not perfection, not certainty, only willingness. It was a challenge, demanding that I confront old fears of loss and vulnerability. Yet even with that tension, the pull remained irresistible. I had learned that love often thrives not in the absence of fear, but in the courage to remain present despite it. And I was beginning to understand that courage fully, in ways I hadn't anticipated. In the quiet that followed, I noticed how our interactions had begun to shape the rhythm of my days. Ordinary routines, coffee in the morning, the walk to the bookstore, the sound of rain against the windows, carried new weight, as though each detail had been subtly transformed by the awareness of her presence. Life no longer moved in isolation, it moved in tandem with her, whether near or far. I reflected on how much I had changed without realizing it. Where I had once prioritized distance and control, I now found value in attention and care. Moments of silence were no longer empty. They were opportunities to feel, to notice, to simply exist alongside another person without expectation. And in this shift, I discovered an unexpected freedom. The ability to trust not only her but myself, to accept that connection could be meaningful even without guarantees. What lingered in my mind most vividly was the quiet courage required to remain open. There was no grand gesture, no definitive sign of commitment, only the choice to show up, again and again, fully and without pretense. And in choosing that courage, I realized that love was not a force that needed to be commanded or defined. It was a quiet, persistent presence, shaping life in ways I had once thought impossible. As the weeks unfolded, I began to recognize how much the connection had woven itself into the texture of my life. Simple moments, watching sunlight fall across a window, hearing distant city sounds, walking through familiar streets, felt layered with significance. Each encounter, each shared glance, added subtle depth, creating a quiet narrative that existed between us without ever needing words. I also noticed the transformation within myself. Old habits of detachment and self-protection, once second nature, began to feel unnecessary. I allowed myself to care more deeply, to linger in thought and feeling rather than retreating to safety. With her, emotional presence no longer seemed risky. It seemed vital, a way of truly inhabiting life rather than skimming its surface. Vulnerability was no longer frightening, it was an essential part of connection. What remained most compelling was the understanding that love did not arrive as a spectacle. It arrived in the small, consistent moments, gestures, attentiveness, and shared experience. It required patience, reflection, and courage, yet demanded nothing more than sincerity. And through that subtle insistence, I realized that what we were building was neither fragile nor temporary. It was steady, alive, and quietly transformative. By now, the presence of her in my life had become undeniable. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but persistent, shaping my thoughts, my routines, even my understanding of myself. I noticed the way small, ordinary interactions carried new meaning. The tilt of her head while she listened, the slight brush of her hand as we passed, the softness in her laughter that lingered in my mind long after it faded. Each detail, though subtle, left an imprint on my consciousness. I reflected on how rare it was to feel such a steady connection without pressure or expectation. In her company, I could simply be, without pretense or defense. That calm intimacy, unlike anything I had known, revealed the quiet power of patience, presence, and attentiveness. It wasn't about proving devotion or achieving certainty. It was about showing up consistently, with honesty and willingness, even when the future remained unclear. As the evening settled, with city lights shimmering and shadows stretching long, I understood that love's strength often lies not in declarations or dramatic moments, but in its quiet constancy. It is found in repeated choice, in moments of shared awareness, and in the courage to remain present even when uncertainty lingers. And in that realization, I felt the depth of what we had begun, profound, patient, and irreversibly real. The rhythm of our lives had shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Days no longer felt isolated. They were linked by presence, by anticipation, by the subtle awareness of her existence alongside mine. Even in mundane routines, pouring coffee, walking home, listening to distant city sounds, I sensed traces of her influence, shaping the way I perceived the world and my place within it. I reflected on how much I had changed. Fear of vulnerability no longer dictated my choices. I allowed myself to linger in feelings, to notice, to care deeply without retreat. Where I had once equated safety with distance, I now recognized that courage and openness were far more stabilizing. The connection we shared demanded honesty, patience, and presence, and in giving those, I discovered an unexpected freedom. That evening, as the city lights reflected softly on wet streets and the world around us seemed calm and suspended, I realized that love had arrived not as an overwhelming force, but as a quiet, steady presence. It reshaped me gently, persistently, teaching me that real intimacy is built in the everyday, in small gestures, and in the courage to remain open, fully and willingly, every single day.